Welcome to Dark Tales Unleashed, where nightmares roam free. Join us in the abyss of horror and suspense as we unveil spine-tingling stories, eerie encounters, and chilling mysteries. Subscribe for your weekly dose of darkness. The story, The Haunting in Room 13. Chapter 1, The Check-In. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming a haunting melody on the traveler's car roof as they navigated the winding, desolate road. The traveler's name was Emily, a weary soul seeking refuge from the relentless storm that had chased them for hours. The night had grown darker, and the remote landscape offered no signs of civilization. Emily's eyes were heavy with exhaustion as she finally spotted the dimly lit sign that read, Ravenwood Hotel. It stood like a sentinel in the middle of nowhere, an oasis of eerie light against the obsidian backdrop of the night. She pulled into the gravel parking lot, the headlights casting long, ominous shadows. Stepping out of the car, Emily wrapped her coat tighter around her shivering frame. Her wet hair clung to her face, and she cradled her drenched suitcase as she made her way to the hotel's entrance. The building's facade was old and weathered, the paint peeling in places, and the once grand architecture now cloaked in an air of decay. Emily's tired eyes met those of the hotel's manager, Mr. Anderson, who appeared at the front desk. He was an elderly man with a hunched back and an unsettlingly calm demeanor. His voice was as raspy as the howling wind outside. "Good evening, miss. You're just in time," he said, his ease narrowing as he handed her an old-fashioned key. "You're in room 13, the last available room." Emily nodded, a shiver running down her spine, though she couldn't quite place why. She had heard rumors about room 13 from locals on her journey, but she dismissed them as mere superstitions. Little did Emily know that her decision to stay in room 13 would mark the beginning of a harrowing ordeal she could never have imagined. As Emily took the weathered key from Mr. Anderson, she couldn't help but notice the discomfort that briefly flickered across his face. It was as though he carried the weight of room 13's dark reputation on his shoulders. "Thank you," Emily replied, offering a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was too exhausted to dwell on superstitions and old tales. All she craved was a warm bed and a good night's sleep. With the heavy key in hand, Emily followed Mr. Anderson down a dimly lit corridor. The flickering overhead lights cast eerie shadows that danced along the worn-out carpet. The hotel was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards underfoot. Finally, they reached room 13, its door looming ominously at the end of the hallway. The air grew heavy with an unexplainable tension, and Emily hesitated for a moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple hotel room. "Here you are, miss," Mr. Anderson said, unlocking the door with an old brass key that seemed as ancient as the hotel itself. Emily stepped into the room, and a chill ran down her spine. The decor was reminiscent of a bygone era, with faded floral wallpaper and antique furniture. Dusty curtains billowed in the faint breeze that seeped through the cracked window pane. The room had an unsettling aura, as though it held the memories of countless guests who had come before. Emily tried to dismiss her unease, attributing it to fatigue and the eerie ambiance of the hotel. "Good night, miss," Mr. Anderson said with a somber nod before retreating down the corridor, leaving Emily alone in room 13. As the door closed with a soft click, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something lurked just beyond the edges of her perception. She sighed, hoping that a warm shower and a few hours of sleep would dispel her unease. But little did she know that room 13 held secrets that refused to stay hidden. Emily's unease lingered as she unpacked her belongings in the dimly lit room 13. The hotel's manager's warning about the room's curse echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. She couldn't help but wonder about the stories and superstitions that had led to such a reputation. Just as she was about to dismiss the warnings as mere folklore, a soft knock on the door made her jump. Startled, she rushed to open it, expecting to find Mr. Anderson with some forgotten piece of information, or perhaps a change of room assignment. However, it wasn't the hotel manager who stood at the door. Instead, it was an elderly woman, her wrinkled face etched with concern. She held a flickering candle that cast eerie shadows across her features. "I couldn't help but overhear," the woman began in a hushed tone. "You're staying in room 13, dear." Emily nodded, suddenly feeling like a character in a dark tale. "Yes, that's right." The elderly woman's eyes seemed to pierce through Emily's soul as she continued. "You should know that room 13 is cursed. Terrible things have happened here over the years. Strange sounds, mysterious disappearances, and nightmares that never end." Emily's skepticism wavered as the woman's words sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to believe it was just local legend, but the intensity in the woman's gaze made her question her decision to stay in this room. "Please, dear," the woman implored, "be cautious. Keep your wits about you and don't stay here any longer than you must." With that, the elderly woman left, her candlelight disappearing down the darkened hallway. Emily was left alone once more, her doubts and fears mounting. The weight of room 13's dark history pressed upon her, and she couldn't help but wonder what the night held in store. Chapter 2. First Night. Emily continued to lay in her unfamiliar bed, her heart racing from the unsettling whisper she had heard. She knew she needed to rest, but the unease in room 13 seemed to weigh on her like a heavy shroud. With a deep breath, she decided to get up and explore the room, hoping that familiarizing herself with her surroundings might ease her anxiety. She reached for the lamp on the nightstand and turned it on, casting a soft, trembling glow. The room's furnishings remained as they were when she had first arrived. The aged wallpaper, the antique furniture, and the cracked window that allowed glimpses of the rainy night outside. Emily felt like an intruder in a forgotten era. As she paced around the room, her foot knocked against something hidden under the bed. She bent down to retrieve it and discovered an old, weathered diary. Its leather cover was worn, and its pages yellowed with time. Emily's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to flip through its contents. The diary belonged to a previous guest who had stayed in room 13 many years ago. The entries were filled with descriptions of strange occurrences, eerie dreams, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Emily's unease deepened as she read about the guest's growing paranoia and fear. Hours passed, and Emily couldn't tear herself away from the diary. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its rhythm becoming a sinister reminder of her isolation. Finally, she realized that she had spent the entire night reading the chilling accounts of someone who had experienced the same horrors she was beginning to face. Determined to regain control over her emotions, Emily decided to put the diary away and try to get some rest. She extinguished the lamp and settled back into bed, hoping that the night would pass uneventfully. However, the haunting of room 13 had only just begun, and the first night was a mere prelude to the terrors that awaited her. As Emily lay in the silence of room 13, the minutes stretched into hours. The diary she had discovered still weighed on her mind, but she was determined to dismiss it as a product of an overactive imagination. It was just a book, after all. But then, as the night grew darker, strange sounds began to permeate the room. Faint whispers, like the soft rustling of leaves, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Emily tried to attribute them to the wind outside, but the whispers were too deliberate, too unsettling. She reached for the lamp once more, casting its feeble light around the room. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on eerie shapes that seemed to defy explanation. The flickering light made it appear as though the room itself was breathing, its walls pulsating with an unseen presence. Emily's heart quickened as she watched the shadows twist and contort. It was as if the room had come alive with malevolent intent. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, scrutinized by an otherworldly gaze. Despite her growing fear, she knew she had to investigate. Emily cautiously got out of bed and approached the source of the shadows, a dusty, ornate mirror that hung on the wall. She stared into it, her reflection distorted by the shifting darkness. Then, something inexplicable occurred. The reflection in the mirror didn't mimic her movements. Instead, it displayed a ghastly visage, a distorted version of herself with hollow eyes and a malevolent grin. Emily stumbled back, horror coursing through her veins. Panicked, she tried to turn on the lights, but they flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness once more. She fumbled for her phone, desperate for any source of light, but it too seemed to have succumbed to the room's oppressive aura. Emily was trapped in the suffocating blackness, her senses overwhelmed by the unnatural sounds and shadows that surrounded her. She had entered room 13 seeking respite, but what she found was a nightmare that defied all reason. The first night had become a relentless descent into the unknown, and there was no turning back. In the oppressive darkness of room 13, Emily's sense of unease intensified. The unsettling whispers that had initially greeted her ears grew louder, their source impossible to pinpoint. It was as though unseen entities conspired to torment her in the blackened room. Emily's heart pounded as she strained to decipher the whispered words, but they remained unintelligible, slipping through her grasp like elusive phantoms. Each whispered syllable sent a shiver down her spine, and the room seemed to close in around her. As if in response to the haunting whispers, bizarre occurrences began to unfold. Objects within the room moved on their own, defying the laws of physics. A chair slid across the floor with a ghostly creak, and the curtains billowed inward despite the absence of any draft. Fear clenched at Emily's throat as she watched these eerie phenomena unfold. She knew that what she was witnessing defied all logical explanation. The diary she had discovered earlier, filled with accounts of strange events in room 13, now seemed like a grim prophecy. Desperate for some semblance of control, Emily fumbled for her phone once more, her trembling hands finally managing to illuminate the room with its feeble glow. But the bizarre occurrences persisted, as though the room itself resented the intrusion of light. The whispered voices grew more frenzied, an incomprehensible chorus of torment. Emily's mind reeled as she tried to make sense of the chaos that enveloped her. She realized that room 13 held secrets that defied the boundaries of reality, and she was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. As the night wore on, Emily could only brace herself for the horrors that awaited her in the room's unrelenting embrace. The first night had become a descent into madness, and the whispered voices offered no respite from the relentless terror. Chapter 3: Midnight Encounters. As the clock struck midnight, room 13 plunged into an abyss of darkness and despair. Emily had endured 2 nights of torment, but the haunting showed no signs of relenting. In fact, it had intensified with each passing hour, as though the room itself had a malevolent will. The whispered voices that had plagued her were now a relentless cacophony, an unending chorus of torment that threatened to consume her sanity. They spoke of unspeakable horrors and whispered her name with a sinister familiarity. Emily huddled in the corner of the room, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Its feeble light offered little comfort, but it was all she had against the encroaching darkness. She could feel unseen eyes upon her, malevolent entities that watched and waited. The objects in the room continued to move of their own accord, a ghostly dance that defied all reason. The chair spun in a dizzying circle, the curtains fluttered like restless spirits, and the antique mirror reflected grotesque distortions of reality. Emily's breaths came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of the nightmare that surrounded her. She had entered room 13 seeking rest, but what she found was a relentless torment that defied explanation. Then, as the witching hour approached, a figure began to materialize in the shadows. It was a dark, ethereal presence, its form shifting and indistinct. Emily's heart froze in her chest as she realized that she was not alone in the room. The figure drew closer, its malevolence palpable. Emily's phone flickered and died, plunging her into a suffocating darkness. She could hear its whisper, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of her own nightmares. "You're mine," it hissed. Emily's screams echoed through the room, but there was no one to hear. Room 13 had become a prison of unspeakable horrors, and Emily was trapped in its unrelenting grip. The haunting had reached its zenith, and there was no escape from the midnight encounters that awaited her. In the heart of the night, room 13 became a realm of dread where the boundaries between the living and the spectral blurred. Emily, the weary traveler, found herself trapped in a waking nightmare, her surroundings a labyrinth of terror. As the witching hour approached, ghostly apparitions began to manifest in the room. Their forms were translucent and ethereal, their faces contorted with anguish. They drifted through the walls and floated above the floor, their presence suffusing the air with an unnatural chill. One figure in particular caught Emily's attention. It was a spectral woman, her long, flowing gown billowing as though submerged in water. Her eyes held a deep sadness, and she reached out to Emily with spectral fingers. The traveler could feel the chill of her touch, sending a shudder down her spine. The room was no longer a mere lodging. It had become a portal to the unknown. The figures moved with purpose, their whispers forming an eerie chorus of lamentation. Emily tried to speak to them, to understand their plight, but her words fell on deaf ears, and their mournful wails echoed through the room. As the night wore on, more apparitions appeared, each with its own tragic story. They hovered around Emily, their presence a haunting reminder of the room's dark history. She realized that these spirits were trapped, their souls bound to room 13 by some malevolent force. In the suffocating darkness, Emily's own fear began to give way to empathy. She couldn't ignore the suffering of these tormented souls, and a sense of determination ignited within her. She would not be a passive observer to their anguish. With newfound resolve, Emily reached out to the spectral woman who had first approached her. She whispered words of comfort and understanding, offering solace to a soul that had long been denied release. The apparition's eyes softened, and for a moment it seemed as though a flicker of gratitude passed through her. The room quivered with a mixture of sadness and hope, as if the very walls bore witness to the traveler's act of compassion. Emily knew that the haunting was far from over, but in that moment, she had taken the first step towards unraveling the mysteries of Room 13 and the restless spirits that dwelled within. With each passing moment, the fear that gripped Emily in Room 13 intensified. The encounters with spectral apparitions and the eerie whispers had pushed her to the brink of terror. Yet in the midst of the supernatural, she clung to her resolve to understand the inexplicable. The ghostly figures continued to manifest, their presence an ever-present reminder of the room's haunted history. Emily's attempts to communicate with them yielded only fragmented responses, cryptic utterances that offered no clear explanations for their torment. As she struggled to comprehend the unexplainable, a gnawing dread settled in the pit of her stomach. The room's malevolent aura seemed to feed on her fear, and the whispers grew more insistent, their words laced with an undeniable menace. The objects in the room continued their unsettling movements, as though they were caught in a macabre dance orchestrated by an unseen conductor. Emily's belongings shifted and slid across surfaces, defying the laws of physics. She knew that she was teetering on the precipice of a reality that defied logic and reason. The fear was all-encompassing, threatening to consume her. Yet, Emily was determined to unravel the mysteries of Room 13, to shed light on the darkness that had plagued it for so long. With trembling hands, she reached for the diary she had discovered on the first night. Its pages were filled with the accounts of previous guests who had encountered the supernatural in this very room. Their words painted a chilling portrait of the inexplicable events that had transpired within these walls. Emily's heart sank as she read about their struggles, their fear, and their desperate attempts to escape Room 13. It became clear that she was not the first to confront the malevolent forces that dwelled here, nor would she be the last. The fear that had grown within her was now a driving force, compelling her to uncover the truth behind the haunting of Room 13. With each page she turned, she delved deeper into a mystery that defied explanation, determined to confront the inexplicable and bring an end to the relentless terror that held her captive. The first part has ended. We will see you in the second and final part. We hope you like the video and follow us on the channel. Thank you for listening. We will see you in the next part.